Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our study of Genesis chapter 30. Have you ever started to work on a project or something that it held a lot of promise and a lot of potential, but it seemed like it was just painfully slow realizing the goal, like you're never going to get there? Perhaps it was a certain financial investment. It promised a large return, but after many years, you either broke even or you lost money. Maybe you started a project like restoring a car, fixing up a piece of furniture, remodeling your kitchen, or remodeling an entire house. And as you got into the project, you got overwhelmed and it needed much more work than you initially thought. If you feel that way about anything in life, don't give up. So many people have begun a good work and they get frustrated and they quit just moments before a breakthrough happens. People have walked away from years worth of work because they got frustrated, but they're just moments away from a windfall. Many years ago, God had promised Abraham at multiple times that he would be the father of many nations. His descendants are going to be like the sand on the seashore. They're going to be like the stars in the sky. But Abraham was over 100 years old before he had a son. That's off to a pretty slow start. He had a son through a surrogate wife and 6 sons through his new wife after Sarah had died, but only that one would grow into the nation that God promised would bless the world. That son of promise was married by 40, but it was another 20 years of trying before his wife conceived. They had twin sons, Jacob and Esau, but that was it. And it was made known to that couple that only one of those sons would be the mighty nation of promise. So things are off to a very, very slow start for this family as far as nation building. We've seen the mess and the chaos in the previous chapter of Jacob's wedding. He worked 7 years for the woman that he wanted, but her father deceived him and gave him the wrong daughter on purpose so he can get another 7 years of labor for the desired daughter. Now Jacob, where we are, is into his 80s, and he has the wife that he wanted, but not before he got the wife that he needed. And it seems like the marriage to Leah was an accident or an act of deceit by her father Laban. Granted, that's the means by which it came about, but was it really an accident? As we begin this chapter, we see that the desired wife, Rachel, is barren. Just like Rebecca, just like Sarah. That's not a very good recipe for building a nation that's numerous, is it? And looking back from history, Rachel only has 2 children biologically, and she passes away bringing the second one into the world. Though she was heroic by laying down her life so that Benjamin could be born, looking from the overall picture, nation building is going agonizingly slow if it were not for Leah. Leah was the first wife. She was the legal wife. Leah is the one that today is buried in the family tomb of Machpelah, next to Jacob. And it was her 4th son, Judah, that produced the lineage that the promised Messiah would come from, that would redeem all of humanity. It appears to me that though Jacob preferred Rachel, it was actually Leah that sped up the process of nation building and produced the line to Jesus. So God has blessed this mess. Our text today actually picks up in the middle of all of the baby making and all of the surrounding drama. Now, in the paragraph right before this, in the previous chapter, the first 4 sons have been born already through Leah. And this is really starting to make Rachel feel terrible. Now, Rachel's time is coming, but not as fast as she would prefer. And we always know that's a recipe for disaster when you don't wait on God, when you try to help him out, when you try to take things into your own hands. Her firstborn, that's biologically hers, Joseph, would become a vital character to God's plan. In fact, a large portion of the rest of this book of Genesis is going to follow that outstanding young man. But maybe you're wondering, how come Leah's firstborn wasn't the most important out of her children? Neither was the second, neither was the third, but it was actually the 4th born to Leah that would be the one of having the honor of the Savior being born into the lineage. We'll explain the reason for her 4th born being chosen of Leah as we covered all of the other children that are being born, because Leah isn't done baby making yet. It seems like Jacob could just hang his laundry on the same clothesline as somebody and become a father. Well, with everybody except Rachel, of course, as we will see. But in Genesis chapter 30, let us start with the first 3 verses. Now, when Rachel saw that she had bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" She said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children." I've said in the previous studies that as we progress through these chapters, you might start to favor Leah much more than Rachel. Besides feeling sorry for Leah's anguish as her husband neglects her emotionally and doesn't give her the love that she craves, Rachel is really starting to act unlikable, if you ask me. That very first indication of that was right here in verse 1. She is yelling at Jacob for something that he has absolutely no control over. Well, I assume she was yelling because we're reading the words out of text here rather than hearing them, so we just have to assume the tone with which they're spoken. But Jacob's sharp reaction tells me that her words had a little bit of a cutting tone to them. Instead of reading that she prayed about her situation, or that they prayed together like Isaac and Rebekah had done, and instead of approaching her husband and stating her concern, she just belts out, "Give me children, or else I die." Now, from a male perspective, I would be a little upset over this, if I was in Jacob's shoes, which he was, according to verse 2. What could he do about it? Opening the womb is in the hands of God, no matter what Jacob does. If he really wanted to be mean, he could just point to those 4 little boys in that tent that's across from their tent. They're over there playing, being normal little boys, throwing rocks at each other, setting each other on fire, boy stuff. Infertility was obviously not the problem with him or with Leah. But I do hope that he never said that out loud, though, because that would devastate an already hurting person. Though Rachel seems to be a little bit vain and sometimes a little bit conceited, and also a thief and an idol worshiper later on, as we're going to see, she doesn't deserve words like that Jacob could have used in his anger. So it's always wise to hold words back when it comes to disagreements. Now, to be fair, we must also look at this through her eyes and through Rachel's pain. She watched the man whom she is to spend the rest of her life with be a husband to her sister the entire time during that wedding week, and she even got to be the bride like she was supposed to be in the first place. She watched Leah enjoy all of that. So besides being robbed of a monogamous marriage, she's watching as her sister is popping out baby after baby, and she is unable to herself. This was a very big thing for women in that culture and of that age, and it still is for some people today. So many people are carrying around a pain, just like this one, that made Rachel blurt out the things that she said. Rachel was speaking out of despair and out of heartache. But I want us to notice something here. Besides showing us the complications and the consequences as jealousy and competitiveness arrive out of a polygamous marriage, we also see something else that applies to human nature regardless of age: envy and comparisons. We always think that the grass is greener on the other side. And if it is greener on the other side, it's probably because it's well fertilized with the poo that the people are having to put up with. But we don't ever look at that. We always look at the blessings that other people have, and we don't see that they too are hurting in some areas just as much as we are, if not more. Rachel is sitting there and she feels empty and envious, hearing all of that laughter coming from these children in Leah's tent. Leah, on the other hand, is in her tent crying because Jacob is there with Rachel and he loves her sister instead of her. They both have a great blessing that the other one wants, but they also both carry a great heartache. One of them wants to trade shoes with her sister because she has a rock in her shoe. But if she was in her sister's shoe, she would feel the thorn that is stuck in hers. They both have heartaches. They're just over different situations. Whenever you feel tempted to envy others who appear to be faring better than you, or someone who has something that you've always wanted and you're unable to get that yourself, just remember that life is giving that person a thorn in the flesh just like you have. In fact, their thorn in their flesh might even be worse than what you have. rich or poor, slim or heavy, muscular or thin, beautiful or plain, tall or short, tan or pale. Everybody has problems just like you, just like me. Stop wishing you were in somebody else's shoes when there are thousands of people out there who would love to be in your shoes. When Jesus told Peter that he was going to die as a martyr in the same way that Jesus does, Peter, who already had an obvious rivalry with John, blurted out, "Well, Lord, what about him?" Jesus said, "What is that to you? You just follow me." And we would be wise to heed that advice ourselves. So here in verse 3, Rachel has this bright idea of surrogacy. She told Jacob, "Why don't you try having a baby with my maid, Bilhah?" I always wondered, did these maids ever have a say in this matter? I mean, really? Sarah gave her maid Hagar to Abraham for the same purpose. And I mean, talk about being a dedicated employee. These maids have to be much younger than Jacob and much younger than Abraham in that case because they are fertile. But what is in this for these maids? They get a wrinkled up old geezer for the evening. Then they go through the pain and the discomfort of pregnancy and childbirth, and all they get in the end to show for it is stretch marks. I sure hope their compensation and wages are pretty high. I have to wonder if Jacob knew about the problems that his father had through this same kind of act. You know, the problems that Isaac had had with Ishmael when Abraham did the same thing. Ishmael had to be driven away with his mother because he was becoming a threat to Jacob's father, Isaac. Isaac learned from his dad's mistake. When Rebekah was still barren, Isaac didn't want to consider a surrogate that we're told of. He knew firsthand how bad things could turn out. Add to that, they didn't really need to do this. Jacob already has sons. His lineage would carry on. They didn't have to have another baby. But her solution to this problem was to have a surrogate. Now, I'm sure in her mind, this would somehow make her even with Leah, that it would maybe vindicate her in her mind. But in reality, all that Rachel is doing is bringing a third woman that's already in this messed up scenario. Now her maid is intimate with her husband as well as her sister. She might as well be the one changing the diapers and calling the child hers, but really Jacob has several children with two different women now, and still none with her. If all of this was just meant in a spirit of adoption, she could always reconcile with her sister and put aside their differences. She could help Leah and love those boys as much as if they were her own. I have more stepchildren than I do biological children, but they all hold an equal place in my heart. And I can say that because I am a stepchild myself. I was adopted at the age of 6, and my last name was changed. I was also later adopted spiritually into the family of God, and my eternal destination was changed. But let's see how this tangled web in Jacob's life progresses, as instead of accepting Leah's children as her own, she's going to be willing to accept her maid's children as her own. If you think about it, Leah's children would be blood relation. Her sister's children would be closer to her than her maid's children, but not in her mind. So let's see how this mess turns out in verses 4 through 8. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me, and has indeed heard my voice, and has given me a son." Therefore she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed," and she named him Naphtali. At first, I really did feel sorry for Rachel. What she was feeling was a pain that's far too common in many households. But the names that she is giving these children that were born to a surrogate mother are not names that reflect a heart that's finally satisfied with having a baby after years of longing. These names are not names of happiness over having sons that she can call her own, that she can love like her own. Dan was named so that she could feel vindicated against her sister. Now her sister wasn't the only one with a baby, but like I said, in reality, I still see this as her husband having children with two other women instead of just her sister. And then Naphtali was given his name because she wants to brag about defeating her sister. This tells me that her heart wasn't longing for children of her own as much as it was about wanting to be better than her sister. She wanted to become a mother for the sole purpose of competing with a rival. So now Jacob has gone from having two wives to having three, as it was stated that way in verse 4. Ironically, the first one of these sons was named Dan, which means judged. Just like Daniel means God is my judge. Dan will sure be judged, all right. There are several places in the Bible that mention the 12 tribes of Israel. Each one of them, the list, is different according to what they're dealing with at the time of that writing. In Exodus chapter 1, it lists 11 of the sons that went into Egypt with Jacob to survive the great famine. That's the reason for that list. It only lists 11 because Joseph was already there, second in command next to Pharaoh, thanks to the hand of God. Now, as we're going through the book of Genesis verse by verse, in my church, we're also going through the book of Revelation at the same time. Kind of like bookending the Bible, getting the beginning at the same time as the end. And it's been beneficial in so many ways, and it opens our eyes to so many details. In Revelation chapter 7, it's dealing with 144,000 Jewish witnesses, 12,000 from each tribe. So we have another list. But this list is different than the one in Exodus. Dan is missing. And one of Joseph's two sons, Manasseh, is on the list. Many of the list will take Joseph's name out and put his two sons in his place, Ephraim and Manasseh. In Revelation 7, when God is ordaining 12,000 from each tribe, no Dan, Joseph is back in, and Ephraim is removed, but Manasseh is still there. I know that's confusing, but basically, Dan and Ephraim are in trouble at this point. Apparently, they've done something pretty bad to not be appointed to the task of evangelizing the entire world during the tribulation. So I tracked this down to find out what happened to good old Dan and Ephraim. In 1 Kings 12, we read about a divided nation, 10 tribes to the north, 2 to the south. But it was Ephraim that led the 10 to separate from following the lineage of David in Jerusalem, from following the Lord in that process. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, claimed the role of king, and he was from the tribe of Ephraim. He was the one that made 2 golden calves, told the people, stop going to Jerusalem, stop worshiping the Lord. These 2 calves is what brought you out of Egypt. And he set one up there, and he set one up in the territory of Dan. Now, why was Ephraim removed and replaced by Joseph in Revelation 7? Because of this right here. Now, why was Dan, the son born to Rachel's maid, eliminated from that list and replaced by Manasseh? A few studies ago, I mentioned a man in Judges 17 named Micah. He had hired a Levite priest to be his personal priest, but he also had a silver image and idols. He wanted to serve God and idols at the same time, and you know that just doesn't work. In the next chapter, Judges 18, the men of Dan were moving northward to claim a new portion of land. They had stopped in the land of Ephraim, which was the hill country close to where Dan would settle, and there they saw that man named Micah. The men of Dan robbed Micah of his silver images and his idols, and they even persuaded the priest to come with them. They said, would you rather be a priest to one man or a priest to a whole tribe? Of course, with idols and a graven image, and that priest went along with them. The Danites and their religious conglomeration come to this city that was called Laish, and the Bible says that they were a quiet and peaceful folk. Judges 18:28 says that they never messed with anybody, but the men of Dan killed them. They burned everything. They renamed the city Dan, which is known today as Kibbutz, and there they set up those idols and images and worshiped them instead of God. Now, I'm not saying things would have been better if Dan would have never been born, but apparently Dan will be rejected as witnesses during the tribulation alongside Ephraim, and this might be why it is. Commentators say that it could also be due to their continued rejection and unbelief that carries on until that time, because they were the first ones to turn away from God. Maybe they're still rejecting God when the other ones start to recognize Jesus as Messiah. So apparently, though, they are at the end going to repent and turn to the one that they have pierced, as the prophets say will happen, because the list of the tribes that will serve in the millennial kingdom and in the temple are found in Ezekiel 48, and Dan and Ephraim are reinstated. In fact, Dan is even listed first among that. I apologize on taking up so many times on just one son, Dan here, but it caught my eye as I'm also simultaneously preparing Revelation chapter 7 at the same time as Genesis 30. So it was just an appropriate thing that she named him Judge, as the tribe of Dan will be judged for a time. But let us get back to this soap opera that we're following in verses 9 through 13. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "How fortunate!" So she named him Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "Happy am I, for women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. When Leah was having children herself, she named them after the pain that she was having, in the hopes that, maybe by this her husband would finally love her and her husband would stay with her. And it really pulls at your heartstrings, if you've ever been in a one-sided or loveless relationship. When her fourth child was born, she named him Judah after her desire to praise God for what he has blessed her with. Judah literally means praise. Well, I guess she no longer felt content with praise, because little sister was over there having sons now as well. Well, at least little sister's maid was. Isn't it strange how if we start looking at others and we stop counting our own blessings, we are no longer content. And it's then that we start comparing ourselves to others, and these things that we were once happy with are no longer enough. Verse 9 says, Leah saw that she had stopped bearing. I think she would have noticed that after a few months had progressed and everything, but I think this means that she was content with having 4 sons until Bilhah started having children on Rachel's behalf. She was so happy it didn't even bother her that she had stopped conceiving. This tells me that at this time, Jacob was still doing husbandly things with Leah, the wife that he did not love, and it wasn't working for them to know that. So she decides to take a page out of sister's book. If the children and maids are counting in this war between the sisters, then she's going to do the same thing. Every single bit of this is out of spite and competition. Oh, but the pictures of polygamy that Hollywood and the Mormon church paints are of peace and unity and some kind of creepy common love. And that isn't the truth. It's never that way for long, because human nature is the same: greedy, envious, and jealous. The solution she chose was for her husband to now have a 4th wife, according to verse 9. It's not bad enough that the kitchen's on fire. Let's just go ahead and light the living room and the bedrooms on fire too, because that's the same kind of logic that these people are using. In verse 10, Zilpah bore a son on behalf of Leah, who already has 4 children of her own, but it quickly became obvious that all of this is out of a spirit of competition with her sister by the names that she chooses. In verse 11, it's just dripping with sarcasm. It said that Leah says, "How fortunate!" So she named him Gad. Well, that means fortunate or lucky. "Oh, how lucky! Another son on my side of the fence, sister." The boasting and the provoking continues as she receives another child by her husband's 4th wife. It says, "I'll call him Happy," which is Asher. Then she said in verse 13, "For women will call me happy." Well, I know of one woman in particular that might have a very different name in mind, and it doesn't resemble the word happy at all. These 2 women are at full-fledged war with each other, and these sons, who, by the way, their names will be forever remembered and inscribed on the very foundations that are in the precious stones of the New Jerusalem in heaven. They're given names that represent two very sick hearts in women that are having these children out of spite by this point. Do you think that they're going to feel humbled when they're walking the streets of gold and they see the gates with the names of the tribes, and they remember those names and they remember what those names mean, and they remember their attitude when they gave these tribes these names? Do you think that they're going to feel a little bit of shame then? Previously, these two women were simply pawns in the whole scheme of their father Laban. Now we see that they have turned their children into their own pawns in a war between these two sisters. And in the following verses, we're going to see that Jacob has become a pawn in their bitter, selfish rivalry. Let's go on into verses 14 through 21. Now in the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "Therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons." So she named him Zebulun. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Verses 14 and 15 set the stage for how utterly ridiculous this whole thing has become. They are now bargaining off or auctioning time with their shared husband without even asking what his thoughts are in this whole deal. He's been out working in the fields all day long, in his late 90s by now, trying to earn enough to support this growing bundle of competition. His family. And he returns at that time to find out that his body has been traded like a piece of meat on the market. To show how far off track things are spiritually, as if it's not already obvious, let's talk about these mandrakes here for a minute. These things were supposedly aphrodisiacs. They were believed to have effects on the libido and also on fertility. And in fact, they were called a common name in that time, love apples. Now, modern medical terms would call them a placebo because any effect that they had was really all in their heads. As for reproductive and fertility boosting, it's a silly superstition. The Bible has already made it clear many times that it is God that opens and closes the womb. Even Jacob said that in his argument with Rachel, like 4 sons ago. But now they have dragged superstitious practices into their competition. Rachel saw these love apples and she desired them for 2 reasons. Because 1, if she had them herself, maybe she could finally conceive on her own. And number 2, if her sister had them, Leah's going to pop out even more babies, and then there's going to be no dealing with that heifer. Well, these are Rachel's thoughts, not mine. As they strike a deal with each other in verse 15, it becomes obvious to us that Jacob had stopped visiting the tent of Leah at some point. She's no longer producing babies. They found out that it's not working, so he no longer felt obligated to perform his duty as husband to her. Now, we don't read of any more interaction with these 2 maids either. After all, he is approaching, the century mark, and he still hasn't retired. Cut Jacob some slack. But in verse 16, he comes home from work to discover that his first and legal wife has just purchased him for the night. To me, that's almost as sad and pathetic as her having children with the hopes that her husband will finally love her and live with her. I think of that prophet Hosea, that poor guy. He was told to marry an immoral woman for the sake of illustration in a prophecy. The children that they had were named things like "not my people" and "not loved." In high school, it had to be tough for those kids with names like that. And then to top it all off, when Hosea's wife left and went out to return to be a prostitute, he had to go out and buy back his wife. But back to this mess. Jacob doesn't argue about who he's going home with anymore. A tired man no longer cares. Apparently, they've got him all figured out, and he just goes where he's told. So he goes home with Leah, and Leah conceives. Now, I want us to notice this because Leah and Rachel probably didn't. Leah had stopped bearing children. Her last two children really belonged to her maid. They didn't come from Leah biologically. Her womb has been closed for a long time, and she didn't have the mandrakes. Rachel had them. But when she conceived, it clearly stated in verse 17 that God gave heed to Leah. Not the silly love apples. Leah didn't have them. Rachel did. But Leah is the one that conceives. This was the Lord, being faithful to his promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He is blessing a total mess. Now, with that being said, don't go out and intentionally create a carnal mess of your life and then pray, oh God, would you bless this? Because so many people do. They'll go out and dig a hole and then ask God for a ladder to get them out of the hole. Don't exclude yourself either from service to God because of a past that you cannot change. He can and does constantly use imperfect people to accomplish his perfect plan, but don't go out and intentionally make a mess and ask him to bless it. Apparently, Jacob started visiting Leah's tent regularly again after that baby reopened the womb, because another one popped out in verses 19 and 20. But alongside the reopening of Leah's womb came another old problem. It ripped open the scabs of her once broken heart, and she started again clinging to the hope for something that is never going to happen. She says, now my husband will dwell with me because I've borne him 6 sons. Having a baby will not fix a broken or a failing relationship, and here is a prime example. She bore him 6 sons. She even brought in another woman for a total of 8 kids, and her husband still doesn't love her. His heart has been on Rachel since the day that they had met. Then verse 21 mentions she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Now I'm certain that they had a few daughters here and there besides this one. What are the odds of having sons all the time anyway? But if that's the case, we can just chalk it up to the fact that the sons were named because they're the ones forming tribes, but this daughter is named also for a reason. She has a role to play in all of this. Remember when I said earlier that it wasn't the firstborn of Leah that had the honor of being in the lineage of Messiah? It went to Judah, the 4th son born. That may have been the plan of God all along, and no other reason than that. But the Bible tells us of some things that the first 3 did to put them in the similar ground as Esau, who had disqualified himself, like Dan and Ephraim are disqualified for being in the 144,000. Later on in this book, the Lord will prophesy through Jacob about the future of these sons, and I want us just to look at the first 4 in the interest of time. In Genesis chapter 49, we'll begin with verses 1 through 4, says, Then Jacob summoned his sons and said, Assemble yourselves, that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come. Gather together and hear, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Reuben had waited until his father had gone into the field, and then he went and lay with Bilhah, who was Rachel's maid, and who was also one of his father's wives. Then this prophecy continues in Genesis 49, verses 5 through 7. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let my glory be united with their assembly, because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Simeon and Levi, the second and third born sons of Jacob and Leah, retaliated against a group of men that raped their sister Dinah, Leah's daughter. Now that might seem justifiable on the surface, but there is a lot more to it than just that. They wiped out the entire town. Not just the people that done it, they wiped out a city. And they did so under a canopy of lies and deception. The men of Shechem this man in Shechem had done wrong, but he was trying to do better, and he's trying to make it up the only way that he knew how. He went with his father and talked to Jacob. He stated that he loved Dinah, and he was willing to marry her. Though she was defiled before marriage, it would take away some of that, in their eyes anyway, if she was wed to him. Plus, he promised that he would treat her very well, and he would pay any price of dowry that Jacob stated. He would pay anything to be married to her and to try to rectify the situation. Also, Shechem's father noted that their people could blend with Israel, intermarrying and dwelling in the land together. Problem is they already knew the problems of intermarriage thanks to Esau. And they had a promise that God was going to give them this land when it was time. Not until then. So this was a no deal for Jacob anyway. But Simeon and Levi went about getting paybacks the wrong way. It was clever, but oh so wrong. They put on a fake smile and said, okay, this could happen, but only if all of the men in the city are circumcised. Just like we are in this family. 3 days later, all of the men are in pain due to the operation in this agreement. Simeon and Levi went in there and killed all of the men because they're not able to move. They're not able to protect themselves. They are very sore. So they killed everybody. They looted everything in the city, including the livestock and the women and the children of the city. This entire family has been filled with deceit. And it even said in Genesis 34 that these sons followed suit. In Genesis 34:13, but Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. That is a touchy one here, and many of us feel like what they did was justified, but there was a different way that this could have been handled, and handling it this way excluded Simeon and Levi, which takes us to the fourth son, Judah. In Genesis 49:10 it says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." In that verse, Shiloh's not referring to the future city by that name, but actually the Messiah. The Holman Christian Standard Bible translates it, "until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the people belongs to him." Let us continue on to verses 22 through 24. "Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, 'God has taken away my reproach.' She named him Joseph, saying, 'May the Lord give me another son.'" We saw that since Leah was unloved by her husband, God stepped in and opened her womb, bringing Leah contentment and joy. Well, as long as she was focused on her own things and before she focused on her sister and her blessings. But she was content. Now, even though Rachel had yelled at her husband because of her barrenness, she brought another woman into an already overpopulated marriage and established a pattern for her sister to do the same. And even though the children her maid gave to her were named solely in spite of Leah's success, in a spirit of competition instead of gratitude, God still remembered Rachel. Once again, in verse 22, it was God who opened the womb. This time, there's no silly names that represent a selfish and a spiteful heart. The name that she chose showed faith that not only had God blessed her and had he remembered her, but that he would do it again. Joseph means, may he add. Some say that she was asking for more kids to compete with Leah, but I'm not so sure. Maybe having this one biologically changed her, because this name, this time, it sounds like it's different to me. It sounds like it's more lovingly given. Maybe I'm just reading a tone written into the text again, but it just feels that way. Actually, she does bear one more son, and as we said before, tragically, it will cost her her life. But the son that she has here is very important to God's overall plan. He may not be the one from whom the tribe of the Messiah would come. That one goes to Judah, the closest to a firstborn that wasn't disqualified by sin. Judah was flawed, but those first three sons sure committed some doozies. While this son of Rachel's, her true firstborn, would not be the lineage of the Messiah, he would play a very crucial role in God's preservation of all of these people, ensuring the survival of Judah and his lineage, as well as the rest of the tribes. If Leah had only known what God was going to do through Judah, and if Rachel had only known what God was going to do through Joseph, and how awesome that kid would turn out to be, I think that would have snuffed out all of their problems they had with each other. To stop focusing on what each other has and focus on what God is doing through you and doing through your children. God is at work doing something that's much bigger than both of them and much bigger than all of us. And he was using them despite their attitudes and despite their behavior to accomplish his will. God's will always be carried out.